So to get to just situate this discussion on the financing webinar, on the financing component of the webinar, we know that the building block on sector financing focuses on what is needed to have a sound financing framework for the sector. These building blocks looks at the key elements that are required around which partners engage to maximize resource mobilization. And some of these key components include the 3 T's, that's taxes, tariffs, and transfers, which are the bulk of the revenues that go into the sector. So the main component is really to ensure that the sector looks at what resources are coming in from taxes, from tariffs and transfers, and what data is needed to ensure that all revenue sources are maximized, as well as look at how sector budgets are linked broadly with the national budgets and also the medium-term expenditure framework. So we're holding this webinar with hopes that countries would have calculated their financing needs ahead of the high-level meeting. They would have looked at their financing gap and then would also utilize these various avenues at country level to advocate and mobilize the financing that is required. But the building blocks themselves are just the what of what is required. They do define what is required in a sector, but there is something more fundamental about how this financing can actually be put in place so that it is more efficiently utilized. And so the second component of this SWA framework is around the collaborative behaviors. The collaborative behaviors themselves provided a framework for development effectiveness within the water and sanitation and hygiene sector. The collaborative behaviors are based on an extensive research of what effective development cooperation looks like in the sector, and they aim to incentivize better behavior from both government and development partners in terms of how they collaborate. And the fourth behavior is the one that focuses on financing, and this is the one that is around this ensuring that effective collaboration, which is built around a good sector plan and service delivery framework. We know that in itself cannot be achieved without building a financing strategy and effectively utilizing existing resources. And so the financing building block really focuses on ensuring that the water and sanitation sector has got a strategy for financing, which enables stakeholders to make better investment decisions and also to plan for financing of operations and maintenance over the life cycle costs of services. Now, effective and equitable development of WASH services requires financing strategies that incorporate the 3 T's that we had talked about, that the financing strategies that use data to make sure that decisions are really based on evidence, and also include estimates for both non-tariff for tariff and non-tariff household WASH expenditures. Now, to build these financing strategies will obviously require on transparency and the predictability of sector financing. And the prerequisite that is needed for this to be in place is that there should be transparent recording of fund flows from taxes, from transfers and tariffs. That this predictable recording of information can help in putting in place financing agreements between development partners and governments, can also help to ensure that government budgets, both at the national level or the sub-national level, that these national budgets show the resources that have been budgeted and also the actual resources that have flowed into the sector in terms of actual disbursements, including those from development partners. And that these can also show information on service providers, their financial statements, as well as household consumption information in terms of their expenditures on water and sanitation. Now, together, these data sources enable the legislators and policymakers and other stakeholders to exercise a leadership in directing and monitoring sector investments to where they are needed. And they can also promote domestic accountability for sector spending. So the behavior here is mostly about ensuring that this information is actually linked into the allocation of resources, but that it also provides a framework for transparency, for accountability, and that it enables lawmakers to actually be able to target resources where they are needed. And in addition to that, what I'm just moving now to the collaborative behavior and financing. So I would just now go back a little to the some of the activities that we know have been happening around financing prior to the high-level meetings which took place in Washington, D.C. in April. So prior to the high-level meetings, we had requested countries to prepare country overviews, which looked at what countries were the targets that the countries were going to have, and also there was a request for information to be generated on the financing landscape, particularly in terms of the sector for investment needs and the sector funding gap, and the really very strong edge for analysis on sector for analysis on how that funding gap was going to be closed, as well as in terms of looking at the more efficient use of existing resources and finding additional sources of financing. So before the HLM, we received country overviews from 39 countries, and 37 of these actually had identified their investment needs, and the same number, 37, also had calculated their funding gap for the SDGs. And looking at what was shared with us, countries show that their funding gap is somewhere in the range of 30 to 70% of what is required for the sector to be efficiently resourced. And then we also had a few countries indicate that they were intending to align their countries' plans with the SDGs in the aftermath of the high-level meetings. Now, in many countries, what we also saw coming out of these country overviews is that a number of countries are looking to public budgets for additional SDG financing. But this is, in a way, it shows the most available source of funding, which are taxes that come in through the public purse, but it also shows that there's this limited focus on just the national budgets, and avenues for attracting additional financing did not emerge critically in the analysis that came out through the country overviews. There's also a seeming continued dependence on aid in some of the country overviews that actually were shared. So countries were pointing to their public budgets for additional financing, and in addition to that, countries were also looking to aid, and they also pointed out persistent absorption challenges. With this consistent analysis that was coming out on issues of having commitments that have been given either by the government or donors being much higher than the actual disbursements of the funding, and then the disbursements also being higher than the actual expenditures. So this trend in itself would lead to lower resources being allocated to the sector if the sector is being seen as not absorbing the resources that are available. And this lack of absorption, or indeed absorption challenges, could relate more broadly to something that's systemic within the sector, perhaps issues related to capacity within the sector to turn the revenue into services. One of the other issues that also emerged in these country overviews is that the sector is viewed as a high risk for commercial private financing, which are additional sources of financing that form a broad part of the presentation that we have today. and also some of the issues that came out in these country overviews were that there's need for more analysis and strategies for closing the funding gap, particularly on issues of attracting additional financing, where these sources of additional funding, that analysis needed to be strengthened. And a very big component that still needs to be strengthened is the area of effective utilization of existing resources. So this is how far we wanted to go in terms of sharing a very quick synopsis of where we're coming from. But at this point, let me pause to see if there are any questions, and please feel free to take up those questions in the chat, or to type in the chat, or to take up the floor and ask the question so that we can get a bit of a discussion going. And in the meanwhile, I will also try to see if we can get Dominic. So let's check if there's any question. Please just make sure your mic is not mute, and then we can get your question. Okay, so I will just check to see if there's any question. So it looks like we don't. Okay, Cameron is typing. Cameron, you can take up the floor. I'll just enable your mic. You can take up the floor.
Thank you very much, Tali. I was asking only one quick question, that the format of country overview paper, do you think that it will remain the same for the next HLM, or do you think there are discussions that it will adopt a new format?
Okay, thank you so much, Cameron, for that. I think the format, it looks like it was helpful to actually put the analysis on the building blocks and collaborative behaviors. So I think we will try as much as possible not to deviate. But what I can foresee as a major, it's not really a big shift, is that if the focus of the next HLM is, say, on the next sector ministers meeting is on something else other than financing. So the component that we had on financing in this previous model would then be replaced by that focus of that sector ministers meeting. So for argument's sake, let's say the sector ministers meeting's focus was on monitoring and data, for example. So we had one component of the country overview which looked at financing. We would replace that component with that monitoring and data, so that there can be a lot more focus then on that issue. But the other broad sort of information on where each of the building blocks are, I think that would still remain predominantly the same. Thank you. Cameron, I hope that is helpful. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Nelson. So what we saw in terms of the views that were coming from the country overviews is that some of the countries were saying that they're having difficulties to absorb resources. And so, for example, Brazil was saying this absorption challenge is not just at the national level, it's also, it goes to the utility level, it goes to the community level, where the actual implementation is happening. And sometimes those challenges are because there is insufficient capacity to get the resources going, but it could also be issues related to other building blocks or collaborative behaviors, such as the failure to utilize say the procurement system properly. So if procurements are not done in time, then the service is not able to be procured in time, and therefore the financing does not get to flow when it is required to flow. So I think that this issue of persistent absorption challenges is seen across the board, and what we had hoped to encourage in the conversation ahead of the HLM was for countries to look at all these building blocks and give them a fitness test in view of the SDGs. So are all these 5 building blocks really fit for the SDGs? Is there something, say, for example, on institutional arrangements that still needs to be worked on, or is there something in terms of capacity that still needs to be worked on to ensure that the resources do flow, that resources actually tend from financing into services? So I thank you so much for the questions that we've had so far, and we've just been joined by Engineer Ghulam, who will speak to some of the issues in Afghanistan, but we have not heard Dominic. He's joining from London, and it's still 5 a.m. there, so I hope that he just didn't miss the time. But what I would suggest that we do, because he's not on the call, is that we will try and go through the slides, and then if he comes, he will then maybe just take a very short pause so he can take us through those, and then we will get to Engineer Ghulam shortly to share with us the insights from Afghanistan. So if you can just give me a while so that I could have these slides that Dominic was going to present. I have them ready here. Yes, okay. And once again, if you have a question, please do put it in the chat, and then we'll come back to that. And for those that have just joined, like Engineer Ghulam from Afghanistan, please do let us know in the chat the name or your name, or if you're joining with other people, would be happy if you could let us know about that. Okay, we've just had one person join, an additional person join. Okay, it's not Dominic. Okay, so we will continue to we will proceed. So on the financing landscape, and now in terms of the really sort of big issues that we have seen in terms of messaging that has to be put across on financing, is that first of all, the financing equation for the water sector is quite simple. I mean, that's the message that we're getting from our colleagues at the World Bank. So they're basically saying to cover costs of expanding, operating, and maintaining services, water service providers usually rely on non-repayable funding sources. So these non-repayable funding sources include tariffs, which I talked about earlier on, and tariffs are basically a shorthand for all payments made by service users, and these include their own investments when they're providing the service themselves. But these repayable funding sources, non-repayable funding sources, also include taxes, that is, all transfers from domestic governments in the form of subsidies or a tax cut or a free land or equipment that the government can provide. External transfers also come in, and these include external sources from external entities such as philanthropic organizations or donors. Now, this usually leaves a financing gap. So if you look at these non-repayable sources, you put them all together, they would not be sufficient to meet the entire need that is there in the sector, and therefore there will be a financing gap. Because these resources are not sufficient, for example, most governments are reluctant to allow tariff increases, or simply because water investments are lumpy and they need to be provided upfront. They need to be front-loaded to actually get most of the capital investments that are needed. You actually need a lot of money at the beginning. So it's often that these three sources that have been highlighted, the non-repayable sources, are insufficient to actually meet these huge costs that need to be met upfront. Now, repayable financing is therefore almost always needed, and in most countries, the bulk of repayable finance for water has traditionally come from concessional finance. Now, to meet SDGs, other sources of repayable finance need to be mobilized with a particular focus on domestic sources that that could be mobilized domestically. Now, if you just look at this graph that we have there, it shows these various sources of financing, and those that are public and those that are private, those that could be obtained at concessional levels, and those that would be commercial levels. And just to summarize that, indeed, what we're faced with here is a very well-known fact that resources are scarce, and even those resources that we receive are often not sufficient. Now, in sequence, what we would also see is that perhaps this is more idealized, is that it is important to start by assessing the scale of the challenge, which is what we try to do prior to the HLM, by conducting strategic financial planning. This goes beyond putting together a wish list for needed investments and scaling it back based on what funding is available. It actually is about the country being much more strategic to figure out the investments that are required for the sector, to allow the country to take a long-term perspective of the financial needs of the sector and the factors affecting those financial needs, as well as the main sources of funds and the balance between those sources of funds and the needs that are already in the sector. This would obviously need to be reconciled with the potential sources of funding, which could be from government itself or from donors and the other actors. Now, stage 2 would be part of that strategic financial planning exercise. Can also include a process where countries identify how to extract cost savings in the sector. And this is the key component of this, having efficient utilization of existing resources, figuring out these efficiency gains that can be made in the sector. Then the third step would be to identify how the tariffs and taxes can be increased in order to cover a greater portion of these efficient costs. So, for example, subsidies or taxes could be transparent and more predictable. They can be provided based on clearly established formulas that cannot be easily changed, so as to constitute a source of funding that can be relied upon for the purposes of leveraging financing. Now, the fourth stage could be looking at water service providers who can become more credit worthy. As water service providers become more creditworthy, then they cover a greater portion of their costs through tariffs and predictable tax transfers. Now, obviously, this is possible where they are service providers, but where this is being met through other schemes that may not be fitting this actual structure, then the resource mobilization strategy in terms of getting more additional financing can differ depending on context. The fifth element is this aim to get to a steady state in which all new financing needs are financed through these various streams of resources, including the commercial financing, where, for example, the resources are actually coming in from these various sources. Sorry, so I might have missed the slides here, but the slide that I'm speaking to now is the one that is showing now, which is showing the starting point, which is really looking at this financing strategy and having the strategic discussion, and then looking at cost saving from efficiency gains, and then mobilizing domestic resources or revenue sources, and then moving on to the fourth step of mobilizing financing from additional sources that might be required. And then the fifth stage is services financed sustainably going forward. Now, the key component here is that what we know is that we've talked about. Sorry, I think we've just lost this slide. What happened? I'll bring it back. Slide. Okay, so our slide deck is just reattaching. Okay, so we'll just move very quickly to where we are now. Okay, I think we're having, okay, hope we, it seems like we cannot go beyond this slide 11 for some reason. And so with this, I will then just move quickly through the slides that I have, and we can, for those that are able to download the slides from the system, you can do that, but otherwise we can send these as well via email very quickly. Now, the next slide was just showing really that there is a very significant funding gap, which shows, I mean, globally, 114 billion per year is required to pump into capital, is required to get into the sector. So if we are to meet the SDG, and we've said that for countries, this is from anywhere between 30 to 70% of their current existing resources, that the funding gap is estimated in the range of 30 to 70%. And that these levels of development financing cannot be met alone through the taxes and also aid, but that there would be potentially other sources of financing. What the presentation then was going to show is just these potential sources of financing. If you're looking at a smaller scheme that is, say, at the size of households, and that the potential sources of financing there could include microfinance, but it improves in term when that size of the recipient of the resources increases, so it becomes a vendor or supplier when you're looking at, say, bigger communities, when the recipient is, say, a community, and then you get into commercial bank loans once that gets to medium-sized enterprises or utilities, and then you've got bonds at the very top end where they are utilities. So I will also just move on to some of the potential solutions to addressing these financing constraints. At country level, the sector reforms would be really key to help get the financing to flow into the sector, to reduce the risks that some of the countries had identified. And some of the sector reforms could look at corporatization or strengthened sector performance, sector governance, or adoption of pro-poor sector strategies, and then also adopting an incremental and targeted approach to increasing the role of other sources of financing for different types of investments, or identifying subsectors and service providers for which commercial financing can be leveraged, or engaging with financial sector to increase interest in the water sector. So this covers a range of things that could be done, from sector reforms to attracting to advocacy for additional financing. Now, from a global perspective, obviously reallocating international transfers so that they can actually go to areas which are required the most and leverage the sources of financing, to reallocate concessional finance to countries and subsectors where commercial finance cannot be mobilized immediately or not insufficient amounts, and also to really drive the same message, that is, avoid a situation where efforts to move towards other sources of financing are undermined. So I think I will just quickly zoom. We had a few examples from Albania that the bank we're going to speak to, from Albania, Bangladesh, and Kenya. But I think since we've got Engineer Gulam on the line, I think we will pause at this stage so we can get to hear at least an example from within, from among us. But the bank will also going to share some of the examples of countries that seem to be really making some interesting advances in terms of financing the sector. And they had Albania, they had Kenya, and Bangladesh in terms of looking at, I think it's a microfinance in rural sanitation. So we can still come back. We can share the slides for further conversation. But for now, I'll just check if there are questions this far. And then Engineer Ghulam has just shared the slides that we'll also show for his presentation. So if there is any question, please do feel free to pick up the floor and share your question or your insight. Okay, so if we don't have a question, or people could still be typing, I will just upload now the presentation from the slide from Engineer Ghulam, and it should take me just a short while to have it up on the webinar. Thank you, Marisa. So Marisa will send an email with the presentations, with the slides, and for now, just give me a second as I retrieve the presentation from Engineer Ghulam. Okay, so Engineer Ghulam, if you could take up the floor, that's a. If you could take up the floor, that's a. I have your slide now coming up, and if you could just take up the floor, and then we will open to further discussion as we go on. Hello. Hello.
Ali?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Very good morning from Kabul to all the friends and colleagues. Well, I'm sorry I don't have many slides, but it's only one slide, just to share you the Afghanistan perspective on the financial sustainability concerning the SDGs. I'll just brief you on the current situation and how we are going to move forward, and then probably a question to the floor to some of the colleagues so that we could learn from some of the initiatives that has been undertaken in another countries like who was the same situation like Afghanistan. So on the situation, you know that Afghanistan is both a low income and fragile state, which is mainly dependent over 80% to the external funding for all development activities. And under the reporting of the GLAS, which is done by WHO and UNICEF, we've calculated that annually Afghanistan and all the multilateral and bilateral donors invest about $80 million in the WASH sector per year. If we looked at, we still have a shortfall of 20 million per year to meet 100 million investment, which is required. That's been calculated by the World Bank and UNICEF to meet at least the basic access to basic services by 2030. This is actually the situation, but From the other side, having been engaged into the SWA, our ministers, the finance, the sector ministers, we're quite lucky because since last 2 years, while the ministers were at the high-level meetings and the sector ministers meeting, so since last 2 years, we've got a very specific budget for water and sanitation, especially sanitation, because it was not in the national budget. And that was, once the commitment was given to the SWA and, engagement and instruction was made by our policymakers, especially the finance minister. So we got this opportunity to get some funding. It's not a huge funding, but it's a big step that now the sector has been recognized and now being politically supported by the government. Recently, the President's office also introduced a performance-based budgeting that in our sector and in my department, I'm very happy to report that the Rural Water Supply and Sanitation program received last year about $17 million from the Ministry of Finance in 2016. And after receiving only $5 million per year, which was the case earlier, and that was purely for drinking water, not for sanitation. In 2017, the Ministry of Finance has allocated about over 20 million US dollar for the sector, and that's now on our hand to allocate to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And the good thing is that it's based on the expenditures. If you're going to utilize more funding for the sector, so we are getting more funding from the Ministry of Finance. That's based on the performance. So what we've also done that through the support of UNICEF and other partners, we've been trying to increase our capacity and more accountability for the sector. So that's the situation now. How we are going to move ahead? First of all, once we're back from the high-level meeting. The first thing that we did, we had already working on the WASH policy for Afghanistan, and the big step was to revise that in line with the SDG goals and targets. That has been revised and finalized. But then to ensure, financial sustainability of the gains in water and sanitation, again, the President's office has asked us to increase on plot piped water supplies and ensure that all pipe water connections are with the meter system. So for rural sanitation, Afghanistan has also adopted the successful community-led total sanitation approach, which, at a per capita cost of $14 is making huge gains towards, the open defecation-free Afghanistan by 2025. Again, to ensure the sustainability in our services, the government has came out with the national priority program of so-called Citizens Charter. So this program was designed and started last year. So this year, a lot of things have been done. So community development councils have been re-elected and mobilized. So we are providing operation and maintenance block grants to the community development councils, which provides, much needed seed funding for community-based action to sustain the public services. So, once all those meter system water supply networks, which is now much focus, is going to be handed over to the communities, then there's still a small support of grant by the government to enable that those services will continue to work until, the communities are on their stand to fully fund operation and maintenance. For urban areas also, we've, the Afghanistan Urban Water Supply and Storage Corporation, which is a semi-public authority and runs in the urban areas that have been, created. and their focus will be much, on the sewerage management in the future. Moreover, the Afghanistan Urban Water Supply and Sewage Corporation will also allow the private enterprises to set up their own drinking water companies. And we have some very successful examples of this private public partnerships in Kabul and around Kabul, with one provider, serving over 30,000 people. So a lot of, private schemes also. So this is the current, situation. And again, this Citizens Charter program is also based on the performance. So if, the service delivery, the level of service delivery for WASH sector is getting increased, so the money will be reallocated from other sectors where delivery is not very high. So this is something that we've been trying in Afghanistan, and which is now going on. I just wanted to share these examples, but then a question came to my mind that in countries like Afghanistan, which has a potential raise of tariffs to meet the SDG ambitions, can the low-income countries count on continued donor assistance to meet SDGs? So if friends have such experience to share with me, that would be great. So Setali, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Engineer Ghulam. This is very helpful. I mean, you've given us a good idea of the landscape in terms of the financing need, but also some of the process that you've engaged in around the Citizens Charter, and the funding gap that you've identified, but also presenting some of the initiatives around the public-private partnerships, and also these results, the block grants, but also that they are based on results. So this is really very insightful to hear. Let me see if there are other people that would like to ask you for more information or clarity. So
Sure.
Just to check back with colleagues on the call, is there anything that you'd like to hear more from Engineer Ghulam, or is there any question that you have for him? And let me know if you want to speak. You could type in the chat, or because for most of you your mics are muted. So if you want to speak, you would have to unmute your line. So Nelson, I see you're typing. You could possibly just take up the floor. I'll just unmute your line. Nelson.
Thank you, Starry. I'm not so sure whether you can hear me, but it was quite a great presentation that you made, as well as also Engineer Ghulam, and thank you so much for sharing the example from Afghanistan. And I think you raised quite an important question at the end of your presentation. But then I thought, hearing from you, Engineer, you mentioned about the reliance of some external support, at least from donors, and I know this is maybe also a common case in a number of other African countries, where a good percentage of the investments to the water and sanitation sector comes from external supporting partners. And from experience, I know also that in such a situation, issues of let's say absorption of the resources arise mainly because of procurement processes, as maybe we heard from Starry in the presentation that he made earlier. And I think he was also trying to share what the country overview also tried to review on the absorption challenges. Now, I wanted to check, or rather to hear from you, how maybe are you dealing with the issues of absorption in this particular case? And I can imagine that when there are external supporting partners supporting the sector, I guess institutional arrangements are quite critical, as maybe Stanley also mentioned in the presentation, to make sure that the processes and the requirements from our external supporting partners do not necessarily derail other processes, especially for procurement, because such delays are also what accounts for the absorption challenges at country level. Wanted to hear from you, Engineer, how you are dealing with this, or if it's an issue, really, how are you likely to tackle it, at least from the Afghanistan point of view? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I mean, a very, very important point. Actually, on the Citizens Charter, one thing that has been experienced in Afghanistan, probably for those who are familiar, the procurement model has been made very easy because we are using the community-based implementation. So the community-based implementation is a sort of procurement arrangements where up to $60,000. So there is no need for, procurement process. Of course, there are, areas because, all the standards, all the minimum standards, the costing and manuals and specification for water and sanitation have already been made during, developing the implementation manual. So that's, a very standard process where all the donors and the government have agreed upon. And that's, because communities are putting, again, 10% at least their contribution either in kind or in cash. So it means, that from the procurement perspective, the community-based modality is very fast to provide service deliveries. And in the wash sector in our country, about 90% of the projects are implemented through the communities, except those very complicated, projects which needs more engineering resources. That's done through the private sectors. But this is only the implementation through the government. As I said, it's already open for the private sector that they can, invest and they can, sign an agreement with the government. That is something that's, now common for the wash sector. Again, on the absorption capacity that you raised, the good thing is that citizens charters outreaches up to the village level. Previously, we had only capacity at the provincial level. Through this program, we have technical engineers at the village level and also at the district level. So that's why, these staff are receiving 6 months training after, they are employed. So while they are employed, again, the community development councils who exist but now re-elected through the process, they're also receiving, trainings, mobilizations, how to do, community development plans. So these are all a huge and intensive package for trainings, which made, the ground, paved for a high and fast service deliveries in terms of capacity and in terms of, absorption of the funding. So we've also started a capacity need assessment for the wash sector that's funded by UNICEF. And this will be a roadmap for us to focus mainly on the capacity building side. Where are the gaps? That is, something that we are going to do specifically for the Citizens Charter, because Citizens Charter is a 10 years government program. So that's why in that case, up to 2025, you are going to have, all at least the rural communities with open defecation free communities, and all the rural inhabitants need to receive, at least 100% basic services in terms of drinking water. This is something that is enabling us and is making us optimistic to proceed. But one thing that I forgot to share, in Afghanistan, over 80% of the people have a sort of toilets. We are calling traditional toilets. So through the Citizens Charter that we are doing through the NGOs and facilitating partners, we have a lot of, community mobilizers. So the CLTS would be a key instrument to upgrade all those toilets, because currently the improved sanitation coverage in Afghanistan is 39%. So, for all of you, my question raises that how we could, reach 60% of the country in another 10 years or so. So that this 80% existence of the toilets will enable us to move ahead very fast. So I hope I have covered the questions you raised, Philip. Yeah. I have another question, Sitali, from Mr. Kamran from Pakistan.
Yes.
Yeah. He is also asking, that did you pilot test metering of water before at-scale adoption? So yes, we've done in the rural areas. We implemented a couple of experimental projects, and I can share you the result that in Kabul we don't have 24 hours access to drinking water in the pipes. It's about 8 hours, 10 hours, maximum 6 hours. But in those communities that we experimented, they have access to drinking water 24 hours, and they have outsourced the operation and maintenance to small private sector companies. And their saving, in addition to the benefit that the private sector is getting, is also very enormous. In Herat province, the two schemes that we did as a pilot, the saving that the community had, they used to, rehabilitate and clean some of their streets and roads and, construct small culverts, from the savings that they made through this operation and maintenance by the private sector through the meter system. So that's something that we found very successful. And then we signed MOU with the Afghanistan urban water supply that, while we are doing rural water supply networks, then over, 200 or 100 house connection, then those networks are automatically taken over by the urban water supply. And that's, another safeguard for us to ensure the sustainability of those services. Yeah, thank you. I hope I've answered your question, Kamran. Thanks.
Thank you so much to you and also to the colleagues that put the questions forward. There was also a question from Batnasan that I think is more general to all of us, and I think this can actually save us. It can serve as a question that that can actually create a lot of discussion. That would be longer than the time we have as well. But the question is about privatization of urban water supply and sewerage. Is it a good solution for sustainability? So I think if there are colleagues who would like to try and give a go at this question, I think that this would be good. I think a lot of things that we were hearing prior to the HLM, if I was to try and take a go at this question, was that the SDGs are very ambitious. So looking at these very lofty targets which require a lot of money means that we need to make trade-offs. Now, those trade-offs are up to the countries to actually make a decision. How do we best deliver on this big challenge of the SDGs? So do we do this just simply by using public resources completely? So in that case, then you could have one extreme which is purely done through public resource mobilization, and those resources go through public channels, and you even have maybe public service providers. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is you completely privatize. But both have got trade-offs. On one hand, it could be that maybe the system is bogged with inefficiencies, but on the other side, it could be that the equity concerns are lost when you completely sort of privatize. But Is there so countries in terms of decision making then have to make a decision where do they place their service delivery plan so that it is able to deliver effectively? Is it a combination of public and private? How much is public? How much is private? And if the question is we're doing a lot more public, what are we foregoing from the other part of the system that could be provided through private? So these were just sort of questions that could help to get to a decision and to get to a right calibration of where the balance lies. But that balance will never be the same in every situation, so it will never be complete private or complete public in almost all the circumstances. But I think these trade-offs that have to be made in terms of what sources of revenue do we have, and how can we actually use these resources to actually target the areas that need them the most and also give us the best results. And I found this as a very key issue as people sort of were discussing around the finance ministers meeting in terms of how to approach this issue. I think the presentation that we had today looks a lot at these conventional sources of financing, but you would also see that in some cases that would work, but in some cases you need a lot to actually get to a place where utilities are credit worthy. And what do you need to do to actually get a utility to a point where it is credit worthy and it's able to actually attract this private financing? I think those are also big questions that have to be tackled by decision makers. So I think if there are other contributions to respond to Batnasan's question, I think that would be good to tackle that. I see, Engineer Gulam, that you've responded in the chat here. You're saying yes, in the low-income countries, yes, it's a best option since the government cannot find all the needs. Okay, thank you so much. I think this adds to the conversation. Do we have any other contributions to the questions that we have been given? And there's also a big question that Engineer Gulam has given us. Can low-income countries count on continued donor assistance to meet the SDGs? So this is also one other question that could be responded during the course of this conversation, or we will take it up as Secretariat and see if we can work with other partners to put up a very short contribution to respond to this question. But let me check if there are people who would like to respond to the question of privatization and sustainability, and also the question about additional financing from donors. Is there anybody? If you could just type in the chat. Once you start typing in the chat, I will know that you want to say something. Then I will unmute your line. Cameron, I'm unmuting your line. Right. Okay. Cameron, you could take up the floor.
Thank you very much, Sitali. Once we presented this presentation, same as the slides from Dominic, in joint sector review in one of the province in Pakistan, the government was quite skeptical about the role of development partners, and they asked us few questions that I just want to share with you. And they were asking question that how ethical is it for the development partners to promote the commercial financing, and how far we can go to do this. The answer that we had from the best of our knowledge was that we said that we are sharing it as an option to fill in the financial gap of the sector, because at some point we want to set our targets and meet the SDGs. But this is not the only option that we would really go aggressively promoting as development partners. So I just want to know if there has been such debate among the development sector partners of SWA, and how the ethics have been discussed in while presenting the commercial financing option to the government.
Wonderful. So I'm just now trying to bring up the slide, because there's a part that I think is really important for all of us. So I think the presentation talks a lot about these commercial sources of funding, just to fill the bulk of the resources that are not there. However, the resources, the approaches to closing the funding gap are actually, there are a number of ways through which you could look at that. So I just want to bring up some of sort of these options that could be helpful as a spectrum. And I think that the discussion that you had was very helpful in terms of tackling two things. One being that this is just one of the options, that there are other options, but though all these options have got their challenges. So one thing that is there is that if you're looking only at a public budget from the government, which is what most of the countries said that they were going to do to get additional financing for the SDGs in their country overviews, but that envelope is constrained most of the times, and it can be pushed only so much. So therefore, what is the next possible source of funding? Aid. How far can you push that envelope for aid as well? And I think this is also where the question that Engineer Kulam is asking at the end becomes very vital. Is it possible that some of this aid is targeted only at some of the countries which might have the bulk of the challenge, or for some other reasons, geopolitical and others, that some of these resources are actually targeted at some areas regardless of whether there is need or not? Those are some of the fundamental issues that come with aid, and also the fact that aid itself can be quite volatile and can be very susceptible to a lot of things. Whereas if you look at taxes and tariffs, hopefully those are the most stable sources of funding. Now, if you look at this public budget, if you look at aid, and if you've exhausted those means, then what next? And the need is still significant. And I think this is where some of the questions then come in. Do you look at making cost savings? And what would those cost savings be? Some of the analysis that we've heard that some of the utilities, for example, they spend a lot of their money on energy, and maybe they're using a hydro source of energy or other sources of energy. Would they make a saving if, say, they transition to another source of energy, for example? And I think the analysis that is there could still be robust in terms of how to make these efficiency gains. But then from the efficiency gains, what's the other potential area of financing? And I think this is sort of where this message on private or commercial financing is coming in. But it's got its own challenges, as you say. And a lot of countries are also coming from a history of high debt problems. And I think we're also careful that we're not pushing a message that pushes countries into more debt when they're just coming back from that history. But it could be that in some cases the time is ripe for these sources of financing to come in, and what is required to actually get to that point where these sources of financing can come in. In any case, I think it's a really fundamental question. It was good to hear from you in terms of what you had emerge as the discussion in the province that you had this discussion. Do we have any other thoughts? And it's a pity we didn't have Dominic, because I think he would have also contributed to this. Do we have other contributors to that question?
Yes, it's Nelson. I don't know if I can be heard, but I wanted to reflect back on what Engineer said, and I think it's a pertinent question. And the moment he raised it, I think I was reminded of the fact that the SDGs have a specific goal. This is Goal 17, that tries to highlight the issues of partnerships, or the importance of global partnerships actually for sustainable development. And if you take a specific look at Goal 17, I think there is a realization and I think a link between the issues of sector financing, and I think there is an effort there to try to unpack and look at what could be the role of the overseas development assistance in this particular case. And in framing the goal, actually, there is an observation that probably there is need to look at the global partnership in terms of the role it has on financing, in terms of information and the communication technology, but also there are aspects that are reflected there related to capacity and the role of trade Of course, some of the things that are also addressed there are things that probably one would say are built in the collaborative behaviors as well. I mean, they talk about systematic issues and, of course, a little bit more emphasis on data monitoring and the accountability. But if you, again, look at some of the specific targets under that particular goal, I think there is a realization that the major role in terms of financing the SDGs definitely has to be played by the member states themselves, the countries. I think there is a desire to strengthen domestic resource mobilization. This, of course, could be through international support to developing countries, but also to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenues. And I think that's the role that probably the external entities are expected to play. But again, I think there is also realization, and as it can be seen in the targets, that there is a role that the external world ought to play in terms of supporting countries really to achieve their targets as well, especially for the SDGs. And it's an area that probably, as we look at SDG 6, maybe we have to also take a little bit more time to reflect on what SDG 17 tries to articulate, and they probably look at how much we can relate with the commitments at the global level in relation to financing, capacity building, and of course there is also an observation that technology would play a role. However, I think there's more emphasis on systematic issues, basically, where the desire is to make sure that there is policy and institutional coherence at various levels. And I think this is what, Starley, you mentioned at the beginning as critical. In fact, when we talk about sector financing, and if we are to deal with some of the challenges related to sector financing, definitely we can say that most of the solutions would be looking at issues of policies, issues of coordination, but also at the same time, there is need to look at issues of monitoring and aspects of accountability, which are well emphasized under Goal 17. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dominic. Sorry, Nelson. Sorry, I was just receiving a message about Dominic, so that took my mind to think that. But thank you very much, Nelson. I think that's very helpful. Sort of this focus on SDG 17 and what it means, and I think in the context of Afghanistan also. What does it mean in the context of the New Deal, for example, for fragile states in terms of financing for the sector? Is there a spectrum that shows that maybe this financing will be there for some time? Is it transitioning from humanitarian to development? What does that mean? What does more development financing, for example, entail in terms of the systems that are required? But if these systems are already put in place, then it means that once those resources are flowing through, then they'll sort of turn into services very quickly. I think what would be an interesting spectrum perhaps to see is what some of the other countries that might have been through a similar sort of trajectory have seen in terms of their aid financing. I think more globally, what I think it would be good to look at the more recent data, but what we're hearing a few years ago is that aid is still a big source of financing for the water and sanitation sector in a number of countries. Some of the countries that we looked at in the CPWG, the Country Process Working Group, they actually show a very significant dependency on aid. But there were cautions that this financing might not be there for a long time, and perhaps that this financing is shifting into how it can leverage other types of resources. So how would aid be used to leverage other types of resources, and what's the longer sort of time frame in terms of aid, and how much can be envisaged as the minimum or maximum that can be attracted through development assistance. But I think those are also questions that could be looked at And I think we can try to sort of look back at some of these questions and maybe even take these questions to the research and learning constituency and see if they could help provide some additional spectrums for analysis going forward. But thank you so much. And I just want to check if there's any last question. I think we're getting to the moment where our time has been fast spent. Engineer Ghulam, if you've got any final words that you would like to share or thoughts, I think that would be wonderful. And then we would be bringing the call to a close.
Well, thank you, Setali. I was actually enjoyed by the explanation which was made by Nelson also. I don't have any more points. It's good that, what the question I raised is small on the continuity of the development funding from the external donors and not the humanitarian things. That's something. And it's good that you raised that is going to be taken to the research committee. I'm happy to hear more on this because this will help us a lot, at least the country process. Because here, the SDG country team, which is led by the Minister of Economy and again the High Council led by the President, is also something that is asking feedbacks and things. So I would be happy to hear more a lot from the other, member countries, from the Secretariat on this point, so that we could share here in Afghanistan level. Thank you very much. So I don't have any more point.
Thank you so much for that, and also for the clarification that you just gave. We appreciate very much your sharing Afghanistan's experience, and we also appreciate all the other people who were on the call. Cameron as well for giving us insights in terms of the discussions that you've already had. I think this has been very helpful because that's what we intend this platform to be for, so that we can maximize the knowledge and information that's there in the sector. I also wanted to thank Nelson and other colleagues who are also on the call who've helped to make this happen. But above all, I wanted to thank all the participants for joining and for taking part and for participating. The next webinar will be next month, and we, as you might have noticed, the webinar we just had focused a lot on financing of utilities, which are predominantly water utilities. So it had a strong message on water financing, and so the next one will be on sanitation financing, and it will take place at the end of October. So we will be in touch. We will also collect all the questions that have come up through this webinar, and see if we can prepare a short summary in terms of potential sources of additional information, or even questions that we could share with other parts of the partnership for them to see if they can contribute in creating more dialogue. Thank you once again, and do have a good day. If there's any more questions, please send them to us. We have Nelson, we have Balvant, we have Marisa and myself who are also on this call and helping to support country engagement as we go on going forward. Thank you very much. You can reach to all of us if there's any question or comment after this point. Thank you.